Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, co-hosted by Igor Schwartzman and me, Johannes Kleske. Follow the Rabbit is the podcast where we decode cultural phenomena and explore emerging trends to help you update your mental models of the world. Today, we're diving deeper into a pattern we've been tracking over the last couple of episodes: how niches are becoming the new mainstream, and why being everything to someone means being something to everyone. In our last conversation with Jan Teder from Calibrate, we explored his Challenger brand compass, this framework for understanding how outsiders reshape markets by changing what the game is about entirely. And we'll pick up one example in today's episode on running shoes. You remember Angela Merkel? Here's a brand that seemed to do something different. They didn't just change the rules of the game, they appeared to win by actually focusing on the fundamentals: great product, smart distribution, authentic connection to their core community. Which brings us to today's guest, Mike Evans. Mike spent years at Red Bull Music figuring out which artists the brand should work with and how to stay connected to culture while scaling globally. Now he consults with brands trying to navigate the same challenge, and he's been watching the on phenomenon closely. Mike recently wrote something that caught our attention. While everyone talks about challenger brands disrupting through marketing innovation, some of the most successful ones are actually going back to basics. They're putting the product first, building from the ground up, and letting their cultural relevance emerge from genuine investments in their communities. It sounds simple, but as we'll discover, it's incredibly hard to execute, especially when you start growing and the pressure mounts to optimize everything through data rather than intuition. We'll explore why this product-first approach is working now, how brands maintain cultural relevance while scaling, and what happens when your 64-year-old mom starts wearing the same shoes as the coolest kids at your local run club. Plus, we'll dig into cycles of cultural influence, why being everything to someone still beats being something to everyone. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. I'm here with Johannes and Mike. But before we hand over to Mike, for the first time ever, we're actually going to start with a quote, which is strange because you would have thought that we would start with quotes more often. But today, the quote is by none other than William Gibson, and it is from his Blue Ant trilogy. The quote is about 20 years old, so let that kind of sink in while I'm reading it out loud. So far more creativity today goes into marketing of products than into the products themselves, athletic shoes or feature films. That is why I founded Blue Ant, that one simple recognition, which, if you read the book, you know by whom this is. If you haven't read the book, it's by none other than Hubertus Big End, kind of like the ambiguous villainy, not villainy point of view in that book. But that quote really resonates why we wanted to talk to Mike today, because he wrote something on LinkedIn that he will introduce himself after introducing himself to the audience. Hi, Mike.
Hey, nice to be here with you and chatting. So yeah, I'm Mike. I'm a strategist, researcher, occasional writer. I guess strategically, I somehow straddle brand content and communication strategy. I spent a big part of my career working for Red Bull Music, leading the kind of global artist strategy. What that meant is which artists the brand should be working with and in what way should Red Bull as a brand be engaging with music and culture and the artists there. And now I guess I consult mostly with other brands that are somehow actively engaged in trying to do something in the cultural space. And when I talk about culture, I mean that sort of, not this kind of slow culture of traditions and languages and things like this, but this fast culture of, what was certainly for a lot of my career shaped by music. I was thinking about this recently because, when I was younger, like the sort of music you listen to very much defined like which category of person you fit into, which subculture. I think over the past years, that's been largely fashion. Fashion has been the thing that's often shaped the cultural conversation. But yeah, a lot of my work is kind of working with brands who work within the music, fashion, art, technology space, and coming from that kind of sometimes directly related, sometimes cultural products or brands or organizations that are actually building those things directly, and other times brands, consumer goods that are somehow engaging in that space as well. So that's somehow me.
Yeah, nice. And I mean, the that LinkedIn post that really triggered us finally talking to each other instead of just being in each other's comments, I think was in that exact space. So you wrote about On and Birkenstock and how they're product first companies. Do you want to kind of tell us what this was about and what triggered it?
I think there was a few things, and I think specifically with regards to On, I think it was looking at where they are right now, which is on this kind of crazy hockey stick trajectory where they seem to just be making all the right moves. And a big part of that is obviously the products, and that is interesting because the product is very good, but it's also quite a divisive product as well. I know some people who absolutely love the trainers, and I know some people who are just like not about it at all. So there's definitely, and with any technical good, I think you often get that. But I think On did some things incredibly right along the way. And I think one of the things we talked about briefly when you reached out was this idea of kind of brand scaling and cultural relevance, right? And what happens when brands start to grow, and how do they kind of maintain that closeness to the culture or the thing that they've come from. And specifically with regards to On and products, two of the things which I think they did incredibly well was, first of all, their distribution strategy for where the product should be to start off with. They were very much like focused on small, dedicated specialist running stores, which is obviously lays the foundation for them being a reputable brand within the running space and actually gaining that credibility. And then on top of that, kind of with the product specifically, building on this kind of Swiss precision in their kind of technology behind the shoe, and this kind of putting a lot of attention into how the shoe was actually put together in a way that would, I guess, benefit the runner in the best possible way, whilst also, I guess, putting attention on like where the product was produced, for example. They're exploring kind of production in Switzerland and things like this. So I think it's interesting because there's many other reasons I think why On are doing so well at the moment, and that go a little bit beyond the product itself. And as you kind of get into this growth phase of an organization, you kind of have to ensure that every move you make is the correct one, because I think like the one wrong move, one wrong collaboration, or can set the brand off course for a longer period of time. But they seem to be ticking all of the right boxes, both in terms of having like a good quality product, putting the product in the right places in specialist stores. That also created a lot of demand and hype for the product because wasn't like a big distribution strategy. And then in terms of like the collaborations that they were doing, they were using those kind of super strategically to position themselves in the right place as well, which I think was also interesting. And I do think this European distinction is quite relevant at the moment as well. I think a lot of people are looking to European brands, which is why the tie-in with Birkenstock was quite interesting, right? Two strong European brands with quite a strong heritage linking to the places that they're from. Just the other day, I went to the supermarket, and just on the pole outside the supermarket, there was a Go European sticker where you kind of went on the QR codes, and it was a bunch of European-led brands and technology to consumer goods to different things. And with everything going on in the US and just the world in general, I think as well, I do think that plays a role at the moment. So yeah, I think the point of that post, I think, was that I think challenger brands or brands that come up and kind of create a wave in a particular category can continue to do so and continue to be relevant. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about what cultural relevance actually means, right? As we get into the weeds a little bit. But I think it's not necessarily always about rewriting the playbook so much as like actually just going back to the playbook and actually doing the playbook, which they very much did. They made all the right moves. And what often happens when brands start to grow is I think they often start to rely on data too much. That starts pushing them in different directions to the things that they're actually specialized and focused on. And I think we're yet to see whether that happens with On. But I'm sure we'll talk about some other examples where that's definitely been the case, and that kind of desire to appeal to the mass as consequently makes you relevant to no one at all.
Yeah. I mean, so when you also wrote, as a side note, the funny thing for me is why I would never buy or wear On, at least for now, is because the most visible face of the far right in Germany is wearing on all the time.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It's for me personally, like from this point of view where I consume most of my media in the English speaking world, where on obviously plays a completely different audience now. And also having like sometimes imagery of Alice Weidel wearing on, which is kind of very confusing in that space. But that's kind of like, that's a side note, that's a personal one. It did make me think about something that Bobby Hundreds wrote. He wrote this really big essay last year. I think it was called "The Case for Nike."
Yeah, that's all right.
And there he described, I think, pretty much what you kind of like wrote in your post as well, that his sister-in-law basically told him that she bought Nikes, brought them back, and had to kind of like needed some other trainers, saw the on sole and was like, what is that?
Yeah,
I don't know the brand. Put them on and was like, oh, this is super comfortable.
yeah.
And that to me was like, oh, interesting. There's obviously now this price point and tag and, quality aspect where people apparently, they don't care if Nike, like if it's an Adidas or a Puma or a Nike, they don't need to know the brand if they can try it on and it's actually better or feels better, which, probably a better distinction.
Yeah.
Then brand doesn't seem to have the same pull as it used to be.
This is absolutely the case. It's funny, from a running perspective specifically. This is something that anecdotally I see a lot. I'm a runner too, and if you run regularly, you actually need to have a selection of shoes that you wear on a regular basis, right? You should have a shoe for longer runs. You should have a shoe for faster runs, so speed work. And you should also just be cycling your shoes because otherwise you're having to replace them every couple of 100 kilometers, right? And what you don't see so much actually when you're having conversations with the running community is people are very brand agnostic, right? They might have a shoe from Adidas, they might have a shoe from Nike, they might have a shoe from On, depending on like what makes the most sense and what that brand is delivering. And I think, we're obviously peak brand marketing communications a long time ago. So I do think at that point, and it's something that I've kind of thought about for a long time, is product does become a more important differentiator at some point as the base level. I think like an interesting place where you see this a lot is like the outdoor community and the outdoor brands. So you look at somebody like Arc'teryx or Salomon or something like this, which obviously gained hugely in popularity, in like 2020, 2021, kind of Gorpcore revival. People wearing these kind of outdoor brands in the city and stuff. And those brands kind of definitely refreshed their marketing over the years. Salomon has put a lot of effort into kind of moving away from being kind of this dusty old skiing brand to being something that's very culturally relevant. But underlying that is the fact that the quality of these things is actually really, really good. So the people who are actually doing these things, going to the mountains, going hiking, being outdoors, they're obviously wearing and advocating the product because they need the product to be good. And I think when it comes down to any kind of technical pursuit, active pursuit, where we see in running to outdoors to other areas, I think the product is really, really important. That being said, there are definite outliers. I definitely see brands, for example, UVU, who we've talked about as well, right? Where I've seen. I've had fairly good success with the product, right? I haven't had any issues, but I've definitely seen a lot of conversations where people have basically said the product isn't actually all that good, and they're actually fully aware, and they are very much just buying into the brand. And I don't think, to not throw too much shade, I don't think that is intentional at all. I think that is a brand trying to figure out quality and getting better and being much smaller than somebody like On, for example. But I think those two worlds still intersect. There's a huge the brand storytelling side of things is super important, but I think if you're able to pair that with an actual product that delivers, then obviously you've got the magic number.
But I think what I find so interesting here is what you really just pointed out is the combination of a really good product and good engineering with the brand storytelling. Because I mean, and there seems to be, especially in this space, there seems to be like a correlation also, where's the trend going? Because like in running, we had this time like when Born to Run came out and stuff like that, where everybody was about like bare feet shoes and like very minimal shoes. And then we had the counter trend where like the soles got much thicker, and that's exactly where On would have completely tanked in the world of bare feet or minimal shoes for running. And now they come in and they like perfectly can ride that wave. And they are the brand that's like running on clouds. That's the whole thing. So they were able to like move along with that. Other brands had it much more difficult. But then they keep adapting to that, like when they're or they keep adapting their brand storytelling. And like you said, for me, it's always fascinating because for me, like choosing a running shoe is all about what is the best shoe for my feet and my running style. Like I would I go to a shop, have them like film me, do the camera test, try them out. I don't care what the brand is. I even like I might choose
the best
colorway. Yeah, but then if they tell me like, okay, this On shoe works best for me, then I'm going to choose this. If they have a completely different one from a different brand, I actually don't care. But it has to be like, it's an interesting part where it comes together, where you still say, oh, that makes actually sense for me. Or the brand is like appealing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it yourself, right? You still care about the colorway, right? So you still care a little bit about the aesthetics and how they look, but actually if it's Asics or if it's Adidas or if it's On, like you're going to pick the best one that actually makes the most sense for you. And I think this is definitely, when it comes to these technical things and the utility, I think in this kind of categories, it's super important actually to have that the product be good quality and functional and work the way it should. I also think like for a lot of these brands, like the story is in the product, like we've talked about, right? The technicalities of how the shoe is made, like On's running on clouds, like that is the brand idea in the product, and the storytelling is in that, like how they actually produce the materials, or like the the space and the bubble that they have that shapes the definition of the shoe. And that's something we've seen obviously from lots of technical brands for a long time. If you look into like a company like Gorewear or like Gore-Tex, for example, like their whole storytelling is in the fabric and how they actually build that and stress test it and put it in the machine to show how durable it is in the outdoors and stuff. And I think like that for me, that is an essential pillar of building a reputable brand when it comes to something that has this kind of an active pursuit around it, I guess, whether that be cycling or hiking, running, etc. And then if you can kind of create that brand storytelling around the actual lifestyle, like who you are when you're wearing that brand, and the kind of people you're playing on that kind of mythology and the stories behind what it means to actually go running and the feelings you get and the euphoria, which is again I think something that On have done very, very well, right? I also know a little bit about On and the conversations that are going on and where they're kind of putting attention, and they're putting a lot of focus on also like building development opportunities for athletes and people to kind of get into the right headspace and to kind of to tap into those things that bring you better kind of mental clarity associated with running. And I think that's the other side to it as well, right? It's like it's a brand that has a good product that tells a good story, but is also invested in the actual culture from like a real kind of grassroots level, like understanding what those people want and need and actually doing something active to kind of support and provide that, I think is the other kind of third pillar there.
Let me try something that kind of came to mind while I was listening to you. So we had Kyle Chayka here on the podcast, and we talked a lot about flattening of culture. And I'm trying to maybe see if that works, and you can both disagree or agree with me. So the quality of the product, I would say, doesn't matter to most of the people who are buying On right now. And And what I mean by that, most people don't know whether or not this is a good running shoe because they're actually not buying it as a running shoe. They're buying it as a everyday shoe that they're wearing in the city. I think that same thing applies to companies like Mirel or Hoka. Basically, a lot of more people are buying them for the use outside of their designed environment. And the reason why they're doing it is because the relationship became between the athlete or the person who is kind of like targeted by the product. It became porous because we're all on the same platforms. And so if you see someone wearing a shoe for the intended use, you are like, well, I'm not an ultra marathon runner, but I like the idea of that. I like the association of that. And so it's a much like smaller step because of the flattened culture. So I guess like I'm trying to make a positive point about flattening of culture, at least from the position of the brand.
I think ultimately, like, no, the technicalities and the quality of a product might not be relevant to the mass, right? But they're incredibly important for that dedicated core audience. And I think this is the case, right? Like, of course, like, don't get me wrong, like, you have endorsement deals and things like this where people are kind of endorsing products that they maybe don't care about or believe in, right? But I think generally speaking, a lot of these athletes like do actually care about like the quality of the thing they're wearing, and not only that, but the dedicated hobbyists, the people who are just like into their running, they're the seal of approval. And that goes back to kind of On's distribution strategy. You know, they focused very much on the core audience through specialist running stores, which created that credibility of a brand, you know, that authority in that kind of core scene and core space. Whilst then you have that kind of ripple effect into like a broader audience where it's the same story as we've always had, right? Following the kind of trend leaders who are probably coming from trend leaders, seeing it on the actual people who are doing the thing. And this kind of ripple effect outwards. And obviously the quality of the product does matter to a certain extent. I was laughing because, you know, On's a company that is as relevant to Adi Gillespie from UVU as it is to my 64-year-old mum, you know, who's like wearing them because they're super comfortable and because like that's still the product being good quality because they fit, they work really well. You know, she's not thinking about the brand storytelling behind On at all. She's thinking about, are my feet comfy? Do I feel tired or sore at the end of the day because of the shoes I've been wearing? So I think this was also something I was thinking a little bit about in terms of growth, and also going back to some of my time at Red Bull specifically, is that a big part of Red Bull used to do activations all around the world, and some of those would be very much with like the biggest artists and musicians and very kind, you know, big 20,000 people events. So I don't know if you would call that necessarily like a niche audience or like it was very much starting to be kind of this very mainstream popular thing on the one hand. But I think underneath that, there was always a focus on doing something that made sense for the underground and serving their needs from a like, how can we support music and culture by doing initiatives such as the Red Bull Music Academy, which meant that big artists were often coming to Red Bull because they knew that Red Bull were the people who were actually investing in culture. Now, the numbers on some of these things didn't make sense to people who are more senior in the organization, right? Who kind of just look at the data and the bottom line and they're like, okay, why are we spending X amount of money on the Red Bull Music Academy when it's actually, you know, when we're getting more money from doing this like one-off thing on TikTok with this artist or whoever it might be. But the underlying effect that isn't always captured in the data is that kind of credibility and relevance, which builds this foundation culturally and in society where like the people who actually care about music understood that Red Bull was a foundation in it. And consequently, that had a ripple effect into the broader people who wanted to be associated with the brand. And I think the same can be said with brands like On or whichever category you're thinking about, is like, as you grow, maintaining that connection with that core audience is the key. And I think there's this book, isn't there, from, I forgotten the name of the guy from Patagonia, but the compass and the nail. And he talks very much about this idea of like what often brands make the mistake of doing is as they broaden, they start to look into different categories and maybe lose their focus. And one last point is that if you so Nike, for example, as you said, I think, Nike, we think about cultural relevance. I don't personally think that Nike has ever lost cultural relevance. If you take a step outside of our strategist kind of trend insights brain, where we're kind of looking at all of these challenger brands like Satisfy and UVU and people like this coming, for sure, they took a focus off investing in running. There will have of course, been plenty of people who still continue to buy Nike products during this time, a huge proportion of people. But yeah, they are a big organization that puts their energy into different spaces, and they kind of stopped focusing on that core scene. So the core scene went elsewhere. And I think this is where they felt the pain a little bit, because there were other brands that felt a bit more connected to the culture still.
Yeah, just to add one more thing that you just mentioned, or you keep mentioning the collaborations, and you actually talked in your article about collaborations that we calibrate. And just when you talked about, because I see a lot of On shoes on older people because they're comfy, they support them, they feel actually quite good in them, feel like they can walk longer. I also find it interesting because you mentioned like the Zendaya collaboration, FKA Tricks. They also have Rich Roll as brand ambassador, who is like a vegan guy, ultra endurance guy with one of the most popular podcasts in the world, who also talks about like mental health and spirituality and stuff like that. And he's in his mid 50s. But he's doing a lot of activation for them. He was over for the Olympics, did a lot of like panels there and stuff like that. So where you see they're not only going for the young runners, and it's funny, like our conversation reminded me like a couple of years ago, I was part of a launch for a new On shoe, like an event here in Berlin, and they invited all of the running clubs here, so as an audience and some members of the press. And then on stage, they like had the product manager and like the marketing manager talking about the shoe. And then they had like a runner, one of the sponsored athletes. And in between, they had me talking about like the future of fitness. And I talked a bit about mental health and how that mattered. And then it was funny because all the audience just wanted to, basically they were there to do a test run with the shoes. That was all they were interested in. And some questions about the shoe, but didn't talk.
Less
want to
talking,
talk to
more
the
running.
Less futures, more running. So they again, like what really fascinates me with On is how they really balance it out. So they talk to the running clubs of like mid-20 hipsters from like big cities, but they and then like all the like athletic runners, but then they also talk to an older demographic, because I mean that's and Rich Roll is the perfect like ambassador for that, because he's very athletic, he lives very healthy, but he's also I think 56 or something like that. So
but maybe to kind of like, sorry, I want to extend this a little bit. I think like my impression is, and I'm kind of like trying to paint a picture here from how Bobby described how his sister-in-law found a shoe, and that is being in retail in a specific context. So if you go shopping in Nordstrom for shoes, you're probably less interested in the idea of a brand, and you're more looking for something that is aimed at utility. And then if you're listening Rich Roll, you're probably coming from a specific point of view. And maybe to kind of like extend this into this kind of question that I like had in that sense, how far can you scale cultural relevance? Does actually On has one, or does it have multiple ones that are resonant to their specific communities? We were talking in the past also on the podcast about this idea of niche and being the mainstream. And to a certain extent, I think companies like Nike, Puma, all of them, they all know how this plays. Like you have specific shoes for specific categories inside your lineup that you target with specific kind of audiences. But it's kind of interesting that there is no cap. I agree with your assessment of Nike generally. I mean, as a business, they're far bigger than everyone else combined. But they do have, like the revenue isn't growing, like the relevance doesn't seem to hit quite as easy.
Sure.
So it's not just an imagined problem, it's an actual kind of like financial problem. And
Yeah.
the question is like, what's the point that On or other brands all will hit at some point where they're like, okay, this is as far as you can go with the playbook that you have.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I could, I don't know a
No.
distinct thing, of course.
Please name a number.
Of course, I think it's what I was talking about kind of continuing to nurture that key audience. And of course, On can play in those different categories, I think, because they built the thing on the right foundations, attracting that core audience. And I think as soon as they start to take the foot off the gas there, I think like that's when they potentially become, yeah, if they go too broad and become too much for everyone and not for somebody specific. I mean, it's interesting with Nike, right, isn't it? Because at the same time, like the Nike Alpha Flies, until the Adidas Adizeros just came out recently, the Alpha Flies were still like the pinnacle of like the marathon running shoe. So it's like, okay, the numbers definitely like may have hit a stagnating point there, but actually like what's cultural relevance in this context, because they're still kind of very much present in this space, and kind of an aspirational shoe for many who want to spend 300 euros on a running shoe, right? Yeah, with On specifically, I think for me, right, it really goes back to kind of maintaining relevance with that core audience, like I've mentioned a couple of times. And I think this was what I saw be the kind of the thing that left Red Bull less relevant in culture or music specifically is like as soon as they stopped doing that, then it stopped being the brand that people might go to in order to bring to life an actual interesting idea. You know, I was trying to kind of give some thought to what cultural relevance actually is and how we define it. And is it about who's reaching out to the brand to work with you? Is it about who's talking about you? Is it about revenue? Because yeah, all of these three things can play a role in terms of cultural relevance. But yeah, I think that can obviously be a little bit subjective from person to person in terms of how you see that too.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of made me think. I read recently this, and I don't really listen to her music, but I read a story about Melissa Carpenter and Prada, and how basically Prada is participating in her world, and instead of basically asking her to participate in Prada's world. And so the music videos are becoming basically product placements.
That's a very interesting point, actually, because, and sorry to cut you off, but it just triggered something which I was thinking about before this podcast is I think that you have these kind of two sides to brands, right? So you have something like a UVU, Satisfy, probably Represent, even though they're scaling much, much bigger, right? Who very much like evolved out of the culture, and often maybe like founder-led brands where you kind of have this real the community is built around the fact that the founder is active and participating in the culture, and consequently the brand as well. When you have a brand like Nike or Adidas, like I don't think you can form like a community around those brands in the same way, right? And for me, as you get to that point, you have to go from being a brand that is kind of trying to build a culture around the community around the brand, to just taking that and actually supporting communities that already exist. So I don't think anybody really, even though it did exist at one point, I don't actually know how it's doing now, but the Nike Run Club was a thing, right? But like, and it was a big thing for a long time. And maybe it can still be a big thing again, but like I do think people are just generally kind of a lot more, well, skeptical is probably like I don't think people care for like branded communities from big household name brands anymore. Nobody wants to see it. So I think at this point, it's like, how can Nike actually just go into the communities that are actually existing within the running space and actually provide them with the real support and things that they need, whether that be like investment, infrastructure, product, etc. I think that would be a much smarter way of building cultural relevance for that brand again in these kind of spaces.
It's so fascinating how we keep talking about this topic. I mean, it's basically where the podcast started with Toby Showen's Life After Lifestyle, and basically the idea that it used to be that Nike would sponsor running clubs, and then you had brands basically forming out of running clubs. Like it's exactly what you say.
Exactly.
Like you have brands that emerge out of community, And then you have bigger brands who try to go into communities, and like this back and forth, it almost feels like a cycle that's happening again and again. And then, and again,
absolutely,
for me, like the big thing here is always like the balance. Like it's not like, oh, it used to be that you had the product and you would do some marketing around it, and then it moved from, it was all about marketing and the product was just how you monetize it. I think it's like again and again we're coming back to like, what is the balance?
Is it something like there are only two ways of making business, and it's bundling and unbundling, where we're going through those cycles of kind of like decentralization in which smaller brands are dominating or at least shaping the conversation? Because I think that's an important part, right? Like, who gets to shape the conversation in what way? And on the business side, none of those business kind of brands really do. But on the narrative side, what are people paying attention to who are sitting in editorial boards? If that's a thing still on Substack.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, it's again, kind of like who is writing about what and what kind of artist is willing to, include a brand or be seen in a brand in a specific way. Because what you said about Red Bull, I mean, we, been also part of that world that Red Bull also, like in Berlin, they would have a huge footprint in terms of what kind of artists they collaborate with. And I think for artists, it's always important to have the sense that on the other side, there is someone who actually understands what this is about.
Absolutely.
And I think, I mean, there is enough examples, like if you watch The Studio today, that's the same thing, right? Like it's the portrayal of how do you combine something that's actually not combinable in terms of it's the entertainment business. How do you make sure that those two things aren't falling apart? And I don't think there is an answer to that. I think it's like sometimes it works, and for a brief time it's beautiful, but then it all comes apart.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting when you think of a company like Red Bull, right? That the product was so disconnected from the thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, like the that is the thing that still to this day funds the business, and they're doing incredibly well for themselves. People are still buying lots of energy drinks. But then what we're talking about with kind of specifically in the running space, but like I think the reason why the outdoor community, the running space, cycling, all of these things are able to have such like thriving communities at the moment around them is because the product is so just they do the activity in the product. The product has this like direct link to the actual activity itself, and often that activity is something which like naturally builds community around it, right? If you go running with people, like you start to create like a shared bond with people, which is something that other brands working, I don't know, if you're working in a tech brand trying to build, it doesn't work so naturally often. So I think that's kind of a benefit. I do think it's the crazy thing about On is they really are the first brand I can think of in a long time that have been an actual kind of, potential player amongst your kind of household names like Adidas and Nike, because even something like Represent, who are starting to do really well, they're still still seen in this kind of challenger brand space, but On is really becoming this like potential household name in a space where Nike and Adidas and Puma's still like not even on the same level as Nike and Adidas, right? But there's just been these kind of names that have just existed since ages, since forever.
Yeah.
And they've been kind of, they've been the old guard, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the movie Air that, portrayed this whole relationship between Michael Jordan and Nike. Kind of, it was also interesting to see. And I mean, I kind of knew it, but you tend to forget that Converse used to be the number one kind of brand in the basketball kind of industry.
Yeah.
And a lot of things can change in a fairly short amount of time.
Yeah.
Because they went from being the biggest name to being owned by the brand that's now kind of like used to be the third and runner up into that space. So it's kind of interesting how transformations do happen after all. But maybe to kind of hold ourselves a little bit to the fire in a sense that, like, we're discussing. I mean, On is an interesting example for sure because they're doing so well. But I wonder, like, if we would need to tell people or brands or companies what to do, what is like, I mean, we talked about, you said being, becoming more attentive to communities. We talked about in previous episodes about being closer to a customer. We had this example of fashion designers in London kind of selling on vintage markets their clothes just to see how people react to the purchases they're making, so they can learn and actually be with their customers. So I wonder what is some of the things that we can do to get back to that kind of relationship.
Yeah, I think like it's not about scaling, right? But how you do it. And I do think like even if you lose cultural relevance, quote unquote, like you can still kind of bring it back at some point. We've definitely seen brands come in and out of the cultural conversation. So it's not that like just because you kind of you're one of these household names and then a challenger brand has kind of come along and taken away some of that thing. I think you can still, the thing is about Nike, for example, is they have the resources to invest in like actual good quality products and things if they actually want to, which is obviously really, really beneficial. But for me, I think there's a few things. So data is a huge one now. Like data is just a thing that drives conversations within brands. And I think too often data is used as people follow the data rather than actually having an intention and use the data to guide that intention. So it kind of works to help them reach the right people to deliver the message or the idea or the product that they already are standing strongly behind. I think this is often the problem with bigger organizations, right? Because with a smaller organization, you just have such a direct and targeted meaning for existence. Like, you look at a small brand like Satisfy or UVU, and it's just like their reason for existence is crystal clear, and everybody working there is just like on that same wavelength. Whereas, of course, you get into a bigger organization and the message gets diluted across the people who are actually working within the organization. So I think like having that consistency of message and using data to actually kind of get that message to the right audience rather than getting lost and thinking, okay, there's clearly an opportunity in tennis. We need to do something in tennis now because the data's selling and we need to do something in tennis, but actually like we're not a tennis brand.
Tennis is the poshest sport, but it's now kind of like back.
It's the new hype thing right now, and that's an interesting one because Honor moving into tennis, right? Or they've been doing some stuff in tennis for a while. So yeah, exactly. So this is like, okay, like is this the start of a dilution that is their downfall? I don't know. Could be. So yeah, data, obviously maintaining connection with the community and the audience and making sure that like the product is actually delivering for that core audience. And when you do collaborations as well, I think it's like using those collaborations in a strategic and smart way. And this goes both ways, right? So up and coming smaller brands are actually often, willing or interested to actually collaborate with a big name like Adidas or something like this because it gives them legitimacy. It shows that there's actually like that they're making some waves within that space, just as much as an Adidas or a Nike might want to collaborate with a UVU or something like this because it gives them legitimacy with their core audience as well. So I think that's another area where like as the brand is growing or trying to maintain cultural relevance, I think can be like a huge factor. It's like who are you collaborating with? Like, are you maintaining that connection to the core, to the scene, to your original kind of fans, and how true are you staying to the company's kind of mission and objectives as well?
Yeah, beautiful. I think there is definitely something cyclic, like we're entering definitely a couple of cycles at the same time. It feels to me, and that definitely, as I mentioned before, it's something that I think is interesting to us in terms of like this idea of the permanent niche as the mainstream, or the death of the monoculture, which helped companies or brands like Nike stay on top. And this coexistence of those kind of like behaviors is now, I think, more dominant because yes, social media is still very much influencing how we behave, but so are also private social media environments and like Discords or WhatsApp groups, where a lot of the resonance that happens in culture is far harder to reach. And so as much as the word, and we discussed the idea of, air quoting stuff, but as much as the word authenticity is kind of fawned upon, I do think that it's having kind of a comeback because it's not really about authenticity. It's about being honestly invested into something, which becomes then kind of the resonance that people are looking for. So with On, if I'm like, that's my way of looking at it. With On, the product speaks for itself, and because the people who are running the brand or they're running the company are invested into that product. And with a company like QVU, it is very clear that somebody is very invested in the brand narrative, and that is extremely intoxicating because it's very unique and very off that time. And that investment being like seeing someone invested into something, that itself apparently is the thing that we're looking for, like that actual, authentic, honest being interested in that thing. I do understand why this happens because, like it's like if there's some purity to the idea that somebody is really focused on doing that, that can be very alluring, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I guess, going back to Johannes's point around the Rich Roll podcast, I think like the signals that you send, the people that you work with and the signals that you send can give that kind of authenticity and that relevance, right? So something like Rich Roll speaks, he may be like in his 50s and maybe of that age demographic, but I think his audience are probably 30 to 40, probably skewing mostly male, but it's kind of like people who are like on this kind of fitness journey, potentially like went on that Huberman journey, for example, and these kind of people. So it's like, who are your touch points, right? Who are the people like actually championing your name and your brand, and what signals is that sending for like, whether you are kind of an authentic player within the space or not.
Beautiful. I'd say that concludes our episode of Three White Men Stroking Their Beards about running brands. Thank you so much for coming on, Mike. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
The kind of conversations we love.
Super. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
See you next one. Bye. Thank you for making the time to listen to Follow the Rabbit. Please let us know your thoughts and suggestions by sending an email to ftr@knownunknowns.xyz. Like the episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And most of all, share the episode with others who might find it interesting. It really helps us out. Thank you so much for listening in. Talk to you soon.